good evening. If you are listening to this right now, you may be looking for some silence. Maybe your body is tired and your mind is too busy. So close your eyes if you want, or just lie down calmly. Today's story is called Amaterasu and the Dark Cave, an ancient Japanese story about a goddess who got tired of shining. If at any point this touches you, stay, listen, breathe slowly, and if you want to follow other stories like this, consider subscribing to the channel, but only if you feel that it does you good. In the beginning of everything, there was chaos. Not that noisy chaos, but a formless chaos, like the sky before the wind. From there emerged the first gods, calm and silent, who soon moved away. Then came the active gods, those who shaped the world. Among them, 3 siblings were born: Amaterasu, Susanoo, and Tsukuyomi. The first, Amaterasu, was the goddess of the sun. Her function was simple but immense: to maintain balance, to illuminate, to sustain. She couldn't rest. The world depended on his constant presence. She was adored, revered, feared, but I was also pressured, day after day, to be perfect, always bright, always firm. The second brother, Susanoo, was the god of storms and the sea. Intense, unstable, unpredictable. He carried within him an energy that was impossible to contain. Wherever he went, he left traces. Wherever he spoke, he caused noise. Tsukuyomi, the third, was the god of the moon. Silent, distant, and rarely involved in the stories of the two. The relationship between Amaterasu and Susanoo, however, was anything but calm. There was an ancient tension between them, as if light and storm could never truly coexist. When Susanoo was cast out of heaven for his erratic behavior, he decided to visit his sister one last time before leaving. He said he wanted to say goodbye, but Amaterasu doubted. His presence was like a constant thunder, impossible to ignore, difficult to trust. Still, she agreed to see him. The two made a strange pact. They exchanged sacred objects to prove their peaceful intentions. Amaterasu created 3 gods from Susanoo's sword. He, in turn, created 5 gods from her necklaces. Each claimed victory based on the purity of their creation. Susanoo, as usual, did not handle defeat well. He did not shout, he did not argue. He just began to destroy. In a silent rage, he tore down rice fields, killed a celestial horse, and threw it into Amaterasu's weaving hall. One of her servants died in the process. It was not just destruction, it was disrespect. It was pain, and it was the final straw. Amaterasu, who had been firm until then, withdrew. You entered a deep cave. He sealed the entrance with a stone and turned off his light. At that moment, the world went dark. Night spread like a thick liquid. The gods panicked. Humans were lost. Days no longer came. Nothing bloomed. The cold came early. Fear spread quickly. And the gods, without sunlight, realized that even they needed it more than they had imagined. But Amaterasu did not answer. Inside the cave, she remained silent, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of exhaustion, out of sadness. Sometimes, even a goddess breaks. And when that happens, there is no prayer that can convince her to come back. She needs time. She needs to be remembered as someone more than the role she plays. Before disappearing, Amaterasu did not say a word. There was no announcement, no warning. It was a silent, almost intimate gesture, a silent goodbye. She simply turned her back on the world and entered the cave. The stone rolled by itself, heavy, definitive, and the whole world went dark. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The winds have ceased. The shadows took shape. The earth lost its shine, and with it, the will to grow. Without sun, the cycle of life hesitated. And it was then that the gods realized that despite their immortality, they were not immune to the void, because it wasn't just the light that was gone, it was her presence, the certainty that someone was there, holding the world by the arm, even when no one was looking. Now, without Amaterasu, everyone would have to look at their own limits, and none of them liked what they saw. In the heavens, panic was immediate. Gods ran in circles, confused, discussing causes, consequences, and who was to blame. But deep down, everyone knew. The name was clear. Susanoo. He tried to justify himself, as he always did. He said he didn't mean any harm, that it was a misinterpreted joke, that it was his sister's fault for being so sensitive. But no one believed him. He wasn't expelled at that moment. He was ignored, which for a god of chaos was worse than exile. Amaterasu's absence created a hole that no other could fill. Not even Tsukuyomi, with her pale and distant glow, could bring comfort. His night was different. It was cold, lonely, still. Without Amaterasu's light, the world was suspended in a time without rhythm, without pulse. It was like holding your breath for too long. Humans who depended on light to plant, work, and find their way began to despair. The crops withered, the animals became restless, children cried without understanding why, and the elders, even without explanation, knew something had broken between the gods. And when the gods break, men pay the price. Meanwhile, in the cave, Amaterasu did not speak. She cowered in the dark, as if the world outside had never existed. It wasn't pride. It was exhaustion. A deep, ancient exhaustion that had been building up for ages. Every sunrise was a charge, every prayer a reminder that I couldn't stop. She didn't disappear out of anger. She disappeared because she couldn't stand being seen without being seen anymore. Therefore, the cave was not just a hiding place, it was also a limit. A silent scream. One is enough. Inside, time lost its shape. There was no day or night, only a dense silence. Amaterasu looked at her own, now faded glow and wondered, what if I never return? What if the world goes on without me? What if no one really misses me? Only the role I play. Questions that anyone would ask, even if she were a goddess. Because, deep down, what she wanted was simple, to be recognized for who she was, not just for what she did. And that, not even the wisest gods could offer. Meanwhile, outside, the kami gathered. There were 8 million, according to legend, but not everyone participated, only the oldest, the most sensitive to the balance of the world. They knew they could not force Amaterasu to leave. They had to invite her. And more than that, they had to make her want to come back. It was then that they began to plan, not a battle, not a negotiation, but a celebration. Because if she had withdrawn out of sadness, perhaps only joy could bring her back. It was a bold, almost naive plan, but it was all they had. And it was in this climate of uncertainty that the great theater began to be set up at the entrance to the cave, with care, with hope, and a dose of despair disguised as faith. Meanwhile, Amaterasu remained motionless, hearing nothing, feeling almost nothing, until something changed, a light sound, as if the world had smiled for the first time in a long time. But she still didn't move. Not yet. The sound was faint at first, almost a whisper, like dry leaves dragging across the ground. Amaterasu remained still, but she heard it. Outside, the gods were beginning the ritual. It wasn't a formal ceremony. It was something simpler, more intuitive. They sang, at first softly, hesitantly, then with more confidence, as if rediscovering a forgotten song. They banged wooden objects, stamped their feet, let out forced laughs that, little by little, became genuine. It was all part of the plan, but she didn't know that. Not yet. To Amaterasu, it sounded strange, as if the world outside was functioning without her, as if they were having fun, and that idea stirred something inside her. It wasn't jealousy, it was something deeper. a confused feeling somewhere between curiosity and distrust. How come they're laughing if I'm not there? At the entrance to the cave, the gods had placed a sacred tree, decorated with mirrors and jewels. The main object was a polished bronze mirror, hung right in the center, reflecting the void. Next to it, a wooden platform was built. On it, Uzume, the goddess of joy, dance, and unexpected things, climbed. She was not the most powerful of the kami, but she was one of the few who understood that sometimes lightness heals more than strength. Uzume took off her shoes, looked around at the gods, and began to dance. And it was not an elegant or refined dance. It was strange, exaggerated, comical. She swayed, made faces, stumbled on purpose. Every gesture was designed to elicit laughter, and it worked. First came the suppressed smiles, then the loose laughter, then the loud, real laughter. Amaterasu heard this, and the sound was annoying, but not in a bad way. It bothered him, like something that broke the silence, where he had already become accustomed to the pain. She slowly approached the entrance. I still didn't want to leave, but I needed to see, just understand what was going on. He put his face very close to the gap between the rocks, and there he saw something strange, a figure moving in a ridiculous way, and everyone around him laughing, as if sadness had taken a vacation. And then something even stranger happened. Amaterasu saw a glow that came from herself, reflected in the mirror. For a moment, he didn't recognize it. Then he realized that was her, but seen from the outside, not as a function, not as a sun, as presence, as a body, as existence. It was a shock, because it had been a long time since she had seen herself clearly, without demands, without noise, just her. Her own reflection seemed distant and intimate at the same time, beautiful and strange, and that image kept spinning in her head, like a calm whirlwind. Uzume, noticing the slight movement behind the stone, continued dancing with even more energy. She pretended to slip. She lifted her skirt. She stamped her feet on the ground with a fast rhythm, and the gods clapped their hands. They laughed loudly. The sound echoed through the sky, as if sadness had become light for a second. And in that second, Amaterasu took a step, just one, still inside the cave. But she was no longer completely hidden. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. The gods' plan was working, but they knew they couldn't force anything. We had to wait for her to decide to leave. The rock was still there, heavy, property. But now, there was a loophole, and that was enough, a crack, because sometimes that's all we need to remember, that there is still a world outside of pain. Amaterasu said nothing, but her gesture was enough. Uzume paused for a moment, looked towards the cave, and bowed slightly, smiling. A smile that didn't charge, that only welcomed. And for the first time in a long time, Amaterasu felt like it, wanting to be there, to see more, laughing too maybe, but it was not time yet. The body wanted it, but fear still weighed on it, and even the gods understand that. The stone was still there. The cave was still dark, but something inside Amaterasu was no longer the same. The reflection in the mirror had left a mark, silent reminder that she existed beyond the role she played. She took a few steps back, went back to the back of the cave, and sat down on the cold floor. Not out of sadness, but to think the image of herself was still there, alive. In her eyes, a strange detail. She looked beautiful, not in the usual aesthetic sense, but in the sense of being whole, even erased, even isolated. There was beauty in her presence, and that moved her, because it had been a long time since anyone had said that. It had been a long time since she herself had remembered it. Outside, the gods kept the rhythm. The sound continued. The dances repeated themselves. But now there was a slight, almost imperceptible tension. They knew they had touched something inside her, but they didn't know if that was enough. Uzumi, however, did not stop. She continued her chaotic dance. With more intensity, she began to sing, a melody without lyrics, made of spontaneous sounds, as if joy itself were trying to be born from improvisation. And then, with a sudden gesture, she tore off part of her clothes. The gods, surprised, laughed even louder, not out of desire, but out of boldness, out of breaking the order, out of the ability to laugh even in the middle of darkness. That was the point. Lightness as resistance. Laughter as a weapon against despair. And Amaterasu, inside, heard it all and felt something strange in her chest. A pang that reminded her of longing. A strange desire to be among them, not as a goddess, but as a presence. Little by little, she stood up again. She walked slowly to the entrance. Not completely, yet, but enough for a little light to escape. And when it did, the mirror caught the glow. It was subtle, but the gods saw it, and they knew she was listening, she was close. And that alone was enough to renew their strength, because when a presence like Amaterasu approaches, even in silence, the world begins to reorganize itself. The gods knew they couldn't rush anything. This whole celebration was an offering, not a demand. The choice had to be hers. It always had been. At that moment, Omoikane, the god of wisdom, approached the entrance. He said nothing. He simply gestured with his hands, as if inviting, without forcing. He knew that too many words could scare someone away. Amaterasu looked at him through the crack. She saw in his eyes something rare among the gods. Understanding. Not pity, but real understanding from someone who also carries the burden of having to know everything, understand everything all the time. And that look was worth more than any speech, because sometimes all someone needs is to be understood in silence. From the depths of the cave, Amaterasu took a deep breath. The air was still dense, but there was a hint of oxygen, a reminder of the world outside. And for the first time, she seriously considered leaving, going through the entrance. But there was a problem, a fear. What if, when she left, everything went back to the way it was before? What if the demands started again? What if the weight of her role fell on her shoulders again? What if no one had changed? These thoughts circled around her mind like trapped birds, because leaving wasn't just leaving. It was accepting a return to the role, to the world, to the expectation. And she wasn't ready yet. Not completely, but something in her was beginning to give way. Not because others needed her, but because she wanted to reconnect with what she had left behind. With laughter, with touch, with the reflection in the mirror. It was a beginning, a timid beginning, but authentic. And outside, the gods felt it. The party continued, now more subdued, as if they respected her time. And that made all the difference, because there is no cure where there is haste. There is no real return where there is pressure. Amaterasu's heart was beating faster now. For the first time, in a long time, I don't eat, son, but how to be. Amaterasu stood at the edge of the entrance, watching everything silently, still inside the cave, but already feeling the vibration outside, the sounds of dancing, the light laughter, the faint glow coming from the mirror. Everything seemed to invite her, but without demanding. And that's when something curious happened. She looked in the mirror once more and saw, in the background, a familiar figure, Susanu's face. He wasn't there physically, but his memory flashed through the image. The brother who caused all this. The chaos that led to the retreat. And her heart sank again, because even though all the other gods were smiling, his name still throbbed like an open wound, as if there could be no full light without dealing with this shadow. Amaterasu hesitated again, because as much as I wanted to leave, as much as I wanted the touch of the breeze, there was still that question in the back of my throat. Did he regret it? The truth was that Susanoo wasn't there. He had been banished right after she left. The gods didn't want to take any risks. And maybe, deep down, they knew that his presence would ruin everything. He was alone somewhere between worlds, immersed in his own storm, but even absent, he was still present in his sister's mind, because wounds between siblings don't disappear with distance. They stay there, hovering, silent, but alive. And no matter how much the party went on, how much the mirror shone, Amaterasu knew that to truly leave, it wasn't enough to see the reflection. She had to face his absence too. Outside, the gods noticed that she wasn't moving forward, that she was standing still, static, as if something was pulling her back, and they were right. The memory of Susanoo was pulling her like a chain. She remembered their childhood, the lightness before the chaos, the times when he was just a noisy brother, not a destroyer, and that hurt because no one wants to abandon someone they love, even after the damage, but you can't keep putting up with someone who hurts you. And this dilemma was one of the most difficult for gods and humans. Uzume noticed the impasse, and the rhythm changed. The dance slowed down, less funny, more symbolic, as if he knew that humor was no longer enough. Now it was time to show something deeper. She spun around with her arms open, as if to say, pain also dances. The scar is also part of the body. Amaterasu saw this, and he got emotional. He didn't cry, but his eyes felt heavy, and in that moment, she felt like maybe she could get out. Not because everything was resolved, but maybe healing doesn't come only after forgiveness. Maybe it starts the moment we decide to walk, even without having all the answers. With that thought, she raised her hand. Just that, a small gesture, but it made the light grow brighter outside. The gods saw it and stepped back a little, respecting the space. It was her moment, and she knew it. She touched the stone with her fingers. The surface was cold, but not as cold as before. And then, for the first time since she had gone into hiding, she spoke, not loudly, not to everyone, just to herself. She said, "I am here." That was all. 2 words, but for someone who had been silent for so long, it was like breaking through a wall. Outside, the gods looked at each other. They didn't smile openly, they didn't celebrate yet, but they felt it. Something had changed. Her choice was near, and the world, for a moment, seemed to hold its breath. Inside the cave, Amaterasu rested her forehead against the stone. She took a deep breath. She knew that when she left, things wouldn't be resolved, but maybe the world didn't need a perfect goddess. Maybe it just needed her. Present, flawed, real. The light shone brighter in the mirror again, and even without crossing the threshold yet, she knew the decision was on its way. The cave, which had once seemed like absolute shelter, now seemed too small. Amaterasu paced back and forth, as if her own body no longer fit there. It wasn't in a hurry, it was restlessness, an uneasiness that grew from within. The stone still blocked the exit, but her light was already escaping through the cracks, a timid, fragmented, but alive light, and the gods outside watched her with silent reverence. They knew they shouldn't touch the stone. They couldn't pull it, push it, or try to speed up her return. The gesture had to be hers, the effort too. All they could do was wait, and wait with respect. Meanwhile, Uzume stopped dancing. She sat on the floor, cross-legged, and just stood there, smiling, as if to say, "Now it's your turn to dance." Amaterasu, with her hand still on the stone, thought in everything, in the centuries of forced devotion, in demanding prayers, On the mornings when he had to be born, even without wanting to. On the days when she pretended to be strong while everything in her wanted to disappear. And now, inside, after so long hiding, she felt for the first time that maybe she could come out on her own. No obligation, no paper, just wanting to see the world again. Maybe not whole, but a piece, a lightning bolt, a breath. She placed her other hand on the stone. The palms are now firm, feet flat on the floor, and without saying anything, he began to push. Outside, the gods did not react. They did not run to her. They did not shout. They did not make a sound. They remained silent. Their eyes were alert, their bodies still, because they knew that any movement could break the delicacy of that moment. The stone creaked softly, like someone waking up after a deep sleep. Then it moved a little, an inch, and the light grew. The first rays escaped timidly, illuminating emotional faces, but no one dared to approach. It was a rebirth, and rebirths require space. Amaterasu felt the light hit her face, a familiar warmth, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't hurt. The glow didn't weigh her down. It didn't hurt. It was light, almost gentle. She paused for a second, just to feel it. She took a deep breath, her eyes half closed. Her skin prickled, as if she were rediscovering her own essence. And then, with a calm push, she pushed further. The stone rolled slowly, making way. The entrance to the cave became clear, and the world, for the first time in ages, saw the sun rise again. But there was still one step left, the hardest. Amaterasu was there, standing on the edge of darkness and light, with one foot in, one foot out. The mirror hanging on the tree shone brighter than ever. It reflected not only her image, but everything she carried. The pain, the tiredness, the silence. And yet, there she was, whole. And for an instant, he saw himself as kind, not as a goddess, but as someone who tried, that endured, that failed, that ran away. And now he decided to go back. She took a step. Her foot touched the ground outside. The glow spread like calm fire. The sky changed color. The birds sang. The winds swirled. It was as if the world itself breathed again. And yet the gods did not surround her. They stayed where they were, in respect, because they knew this was her moment. Amaterasu walked a few more steps. She came close to the mirror. She looked into it, this time firmly, and she saw. She saw the woman behind the goddess, the light behind the function, and she felt no fear, no shame, no guilt, just a calm recognition. I am. Uzume stood up and walked towards her in silence. The two looked at each other. They didn't say anything. They just leaned towards each other slightly, as if sharing something too deep for words. And then Amaterasu smiled. A small smile, but real, as if to say, "Thank you." And Uzume smiled back, as if to say, "We've been waiting for you." The world was now bathed in light, not a harsh, blinding light, but a calm light, filtered by time and absence. It was as if the sun itself were relearning how to touch the earth. Amaterasu walked slowly among the gods, and they bowed slightly, in silence. No exaggerated reverence, no forced worship, just respect, a subtle recognition that she had returned of her own free will, not out of duty. And that changed everything. Her glow was different now, softer, more human. It was still divine, yes, but it was not untouchable. It was as if the light now carried a bit of shadow too, and that made it more real, closer, more alive. The gods stepped aside to clear a path. In the center of the clearing, the mirror was still there, hanging from the sacred tree, swaying slightly in the wind. Amaterasu approached once more. She looked at her reflection and smiled again, but this time with a different expression. It was no longer a smile of surprise or relief. It was a smile of acceptance, like someone who recognized themselves after a long time of loss. She reached out and touched the mirror with her fingertips. The image rippled like water, and in that gesture, she sealed the return. The world could turn again. The gods took a deep breath almost at the same time. It was as if the tension that had been building up for centuries had been released in a single collective sigh. And then, without saying a word, they began to disperse. There was no party. There was no grand celebration, just a light silence full of meaning. Each one knew that this moment was not about euphoria. It was about healing, about rebuilding something that had been broken. And it all began with that calm gesture, letting Amaterasu walk alone, without surrounding her, without demanding explanations. She needed space, and they respected that now. Amaterasu walked to a small rise from where she could see the horizon. The sky still bore remnants of eternal night, but now it was tinged with warm tones, gold, orange, a light pink. The world was waking up with her, and it moved her. Not because it was necessary, but because it was beautiful, a simple beauty, a new beginning. She sat on the rock, alone, and closed her eyes. The warmth of the sun touched her skin, and for the first time in ages, she allowed it to be just a pleasure, not an obligation, just a feeling. In the distance, some humans were already beginning to notice the change. The shadows were receding, the heat was returning to the fields, the seeds were germinating, the birds were coming out of their hiding places. Everything was moving again, but no one knew exactly what had happened, and that was part of the mystery. The gods did not explain their silence, nor did they need to. For mortals, it was enough to know that the light had returned, that the darkness was over, and even without understanding, they would be grateful. Meanwhile, in the world of the gods, a decision was being made. The entrance to Amaterasu's cave would be sealed, not as punishment, but as protection. An even larger stone would be placed there, watched over by watchful gods, so that such an abrupt escape would never happen again. They said it was for safety, but deep down, they knew it was also out of fear. The fear of losing again that which sustained everything. The light, the order, her presence. Amaterasu did not protest. She just watched, and she remained silent, because she understood this fear too. She was afraid too. But now she knew that return was possible, and that was enough. She stayed there for hours, alone, thinking, feeling, breathing. Time no longer rushed her, and no one held her accountable. The world spun again, but at a different pace, slower, more conscious, as if everyone had learned that not even a sun goddess can shine all the time, and that was liberating. The cave still existed, sealed, but present, as a reminder, a symbol, that even gods need a place to hide sometimes, and that this is not weakness, it is wisdom. The cave was now sealed. The great rock placed in front of the entrance was larger than the previous one, heavy, immovable, not as a punishment, but as an attempt to prevent that void from opening again. The gods did this out of fear, but also out of zeal. They wanted to protect Amaterasu. They wanted to protect her world, and the world itself. The place was declared sacred, an untouchable spot in the celestial realm. No one would speak of what had happened inside. No one would dare unearth the silence she left behind between those stone walls. But even sealed, the cave would never disappear. It would always be there. And she knew it. Amaterasu did not immediately return to her post. She did not ascend to the heavens to shine upon all. She remained for a time simply present, walking among the gods as an equal. No rituals, no obligations, just being. And this to her was new, strangely comforting. The other kami treated her with more care now, not exaggerated, but attentive. as if they had finally understood that even the brightest light has its shadows, and that one does not touch the sun in haste. During that time, she spoke to few people. Uzume was one of the few with whom she exchanged direct words. They sat together under the sacred tree. They didn't say much, they just stood there. Amaterasu asked, "How did you know what to do?" Uzume shrugged and replied, "I didn't know. I just danced." The two laughed softly. That was all they needed to share at that moment, because some connections are formed in simplicity, in the absence of explanation, and that kind of bond is rare, even among gods. Susanoo, on the other hand, was still far away, exiled. No one talked much about him, but everyone knew where he was, wandering between mountains and seas, trying to deal with his own nature. He also felt his sister's absence, but he didn't dare to get closer. Not yet. Maybe he didn't even know how. Maybe he thought it was too late. Amaterasu thought about him from time to time, not with anger, but with a kind of sadness that doesn't ask for revenge. A sadness that just observes, that knows that there are pains that can't be solved with apologies, and that sometimes loving also means accepting distance. In time, Amaterasu decided that she would return to her post, but in a different way. She asked that she no longer be worshipped as a perfect symbol. "I wanted to be remembered as someone who was, who fell, who disappeared, and who came back." He asked that his rituals be simpler, less demanding. May their temples teach silence as much as light. The gods accepted, humans have learned. Slowly, but they learned. And so, the sun goddess returned to illuminate the world. But now, with another shine. A glow that didn't blind, but warmed. That did not impose, but welcomed. Looking down at the earth, she saw everything more gently. The small joys, the petty fears, the human failings. And she realized that there was something divine in all of this. Something real, because even the gods, with all their glory, got lost sometimes. They got tired. They hid. And that didn't make them any lesser. Maybe it made them closer, more understandable, more complete. And so, the cycle began again. The sun rose again every day. But now, each dawn carried the memory of that absence. Like a silent reminder, light is not guaranteed. It is a choice, a presence, and sometimes, courage. The courage to leave your own cave and show yourself to the world, even knowing that the world can be harsh, even knowing that not everyone will understand, but still, leave. Amaterasu's return brought calm to the world, but it did not erase the traces of what had happened. The light did shine again, and the gods resumed their duties with more care. However, the emptiness left by her absence still echoed in the small details. Some gods still looked at each other in silence, as if carrying a memory that could not be spoken aloud. The fields flourished, the crops prospered, but deep down, everyone knew it could have ended differently. All it took was a little less listening, a little more insistence, and perhaps the cave would never have opened again. And that was a lesson engraved in the sky. Amaterasu felt it too, even as she resumed her duties, even as she cast light over the villages, the rivers, and the mountains. She knew that something was different now. She was no longer seen as infallible. She was seen as someone who felt, who fell, who stopped. And this recognition, far from diminishing her presence, made her stronger. As the world relearned to revolve with his light, Susanoo faced the darker side of exile. Alone on the edge of the world, he walked between mist-covered peaks and endless seas. I had nowhere to go, no one to talk to. The sound of the waves was his only company, and the memory of his sister, his only pain, because he knew, I knew I caused it, that it wasn't just a matter of sibling squabbles or differences in temperament. It was disrespectful. It was selfishness. It was a type of violence that transcends time, and he carried that like a weight on his back. No one kicked him out to punish him. It was the act itself that required distance, and now loneliness was all that was left. Some nights, Susanoo would sit by the sea and spend hours watching the movement of the water. He wondered where Amaterasu was, how she was, if she still thought about him, if she hated him. But the hardest part was dealing with the doubt. What if she never wants to talk to me again? What if, even if she comes back, she chooses to forget that we were once brothers? These questions ate at him and left him immobile, because the request for forgiveness that he carried in his throat was too big to be said alone. He needed her gaze, for her to listen, and for now, that still seemed impossible. Meanwhile, in the celestial world, some gods were discussing whether he should be given another chance. Some said yes, that time had passed, that regret was visible, even in the winds. Others said it was too soon, that the wounds were still open. Amaterasu listened to these conversations from afar, without giving an opinion, not because she had no opinion, but because she understood that no answer would come from outside. Reconciliation, if it were possible, would have to be born in silence, without imposition, without spectacle, and for now, she did not feel that call. One morning, as she cast her lightning bolts over the waters of the sea where Susanoo roamed, she realized something. She saw, from afar, her brother kneeling on the sand, with his head down, not shouting, not begging, just present, suffering in silence, and for the first time, she did not look away. She kept her eyes on him. She observed, and that, for the gods, was already a beginning, a thin thread of attention, a first movement towards listening, because sometimes the bridge between two worlds begins with a small gesture, with the decision not to turn away. Amaterasu did nothing that day, but inside her, something stirred, a lightness that came not from forgiveness, but from the possibility of one day forgiving. And that was enough. The cycle of pain does not break all at once. It slowly falls apart in the time that each person can handle. And among the gods, time can be long. But even so, there is hope. There always is, especially when the light and the storm, although distant, begin to look at each other again. In the days that followed, Susanoo remained on the fringes of the world, but something inside him began to stir. It was not immediate regret or a sudden revelation. It was more subtle, a kind of shame that did not scream, but weighed heavily. He walked through forgotten regions, helped little spirits cross forests, returned live fish to the sea when he found them stranded. No one saw these gestures. No god recorded them. But he did it anyway, as if, little by little, he was trying to rebuild something. Without knowing where to begin, the image of his sister appeared in every reflection of water, in every ray of sunlight that touched his shoulder, not as a demand, but as an absence, and he learned to live with this absence, like someone who carries a scar that never heals. Amaterasu, on the other hand, calmly returned to occupy her space in the sky. She no longer appeared with the same impetus as before. Her brightness was slower, more measured, and this did not diminish her presence. On the contrary, it made her more solid, more respected. Humans said that the sun seemed different since the Great Silence, that there was more heat in the mornings and more gentleness in the afternoons. No one could explain why, but many were grateful. They prayed less for miracles and more for continuity, as if they had understood that even the divine needs time and care. The younger gods began to gather around her, not in worship, but in listening. They wanted to know what it was like to be unable to bear it any longer. They wanted to understand how to get out of a cave. Amaterasu did not give ready-made answers. She would just say, "You will know when the time is right." And that was enough, because her wisdom now came from experience, not just from power. It was the kind of knowledge that cannot be taught with words, but with presence. One of those quiet afternoons, a messenger appeared, a minor kami, with attentive eyes and a low voice. He said he had come from far away, sent by no one. He brought only one object, a small clay statue with a curious detail. It represented a seated woman, wrapped in a cloak of clouds, with a mirror on her knees. Amaterasu recognized the figure. It was her, but not as a goddess, as a woman, as someone in silence. The messenger did not explain who had made the statue. He simply handed it over and left, and that moved her more than any speech. Carefully, she placed the small sculpture next to the sacred mirror in the central temple. No one else would touch it. No one would interpret. It was a reminder, a symbol of the crossing from the day he couldn't stand it. But even so, he came back. The gods who passed by stopped in front of the piece. They remained silent. Some closed their eyes. Others mumbled words that could not be heard clearly. It was as if that image awakened something inside each one of them, because every god, deep down, also has his cave. Some just don't know it yet. And it was in this new rhythm that the world maintained itself. Amaterasu, firmer, closer. The gods, more careful. The humans, more grateful. And Susanoo, silent, trying, one day at a time. No demands, no rush, just trying. One day, he would come closer again. One day, perhaps, she would be ready to listen, but that day had not yet come. And that was okay, because now, more than ever, there was room for time to do its work. No ruptures, no urgency. It was the beginning of a new era, an era where light was no longer just an imposing presence, but a welcoming space. And that made all the difference, because even among the gods, the simplest truth still held true. Everyone needs, at some point, to be reminded that they are not alone. Not even the sun, not even the storm. Time passed. The days went on. The seasons began to alternate with precision again, and humans looked at the sky with the same reverence as before, but with a new touch of respect. No longer for the idea of perfection, but for permanence, for Amaterasu's silent choice to continue. She, from above, observed everything with calmer eyes. I no longer needed to prove anything. She no longer carried the world alone. It was as if the pain she had experienced had dissolved part of the burden, as if, when crossing the dark cave, she had left behind an old version of herself and returned lighter, more aware, more human. In this new phase, Amaterasu began to visit the small shrines more frequently. She would appear discreetly, like a warm breeze coming through the window. The priests felt her presence, but she did not demand grand rituals. Sometimes she would simply sit beside a fountain, listen to the sound of running water, and then leave. Other times, she would blow a dry leaf in the air just to see a child smile. Small gestures, nothing imposing, and yet profoundly divine. The old gods watched this with a certain amazement. They expected her to return to the golden throne, to formal speeches, to solar decrees. But she was no longer interested in ruling from a distance. She wanted to live, to be, to touch. Susanoo, distant, followed his own path, still isolated, still shrouded in silence, but now with firmer steps. He no longer walked in circles. He no longer ran away from himself. Little by little, he created bonds with other forgotten beings, lost spirits, exiled creatures, nameless rivers. He helped, he listened, and above all, he didn't demand anything in return. It was an invisible, silent work, but one that, little by little, stitched something together inside him. a type of repentance that doesn't ask for absolution, but that transforms into presence, into action, into a new beginning. One night, when the sky was especially clear, Susanoo looked up and saw Amaterasu's light shining in a different way. No longer blinding, no longer distant. It was a light that seemed to smile, and he smiled back, not as if he were waiting to be forgiven, but as if, for the first time, he could look at his own pain without running away. In that simple gesture, something changed. An old bond, broken by anger and pride, began to mend. Not with words, but with time. Amaterasu, at that exact moment, also looked at the same spot in the sea where he was. She felt his gaze cross the distance. She was not moved. She was not saddened. She simply accepted it, as if she understood that some bonds do not need to be pulled back. It is enough that they exist. And this existence, even if fragmented, is already a form of love, a love that does not require daily coexistence, nor promises of total reconciliation, a mature, silent love that knows how to respect the other's space, even from a distance. The other gods, upon noticing this new harmony, became more careful as well. The celestial world seemed to breathe more gently. The divine meetings were less tense, the judgments less harsh. It was as if everyone had learned, with Amaterasu's silence and Susanoo's exile, that power does not lie in imposition, but in listening, that the divine is not manifested only in grand gestures, but also in the pause, in what is unsaid, in the time between one word and another. And so, little by little, the story of that dark cave became a legend. It was not forgotten, but transformed. The elders told it as a warning, as consolation, as wisdom. They said, even the sun needs shade, and whoever listened understood. It was not just about gods. It was about all of us, about the need to stop, to feel, to disappear sometimes. And when the time is right, to return. Returning with light, but also with shadow. Returning more whole. Much later, even with the light firmly restored, some places in the world still held the darkness that remained from the absence. It was not a physical shadow, but a memory, an impression of the time when the light retreated and everything had to continue without it. These spaces became silent by nature. Denser forests, quieter valleys, forgotten temples on hills covered in mist. There, the feeling of absence still hung like a thin veil. Humans who passed through these places said they felt something different, a light weight, a pause in time, as if the world breathed more slowly there, and without knowing it, they revered that silence as sacred. There was one of those places, on top of a mountain that no one dared to name. The villagers said it was the last point touched by Amaterasu's shadow before she left the cave. There was no pilgrimage there. There were no offerings. It was a space left in peace, and maybe that's why it was so powerful. Because in a way, it was a reminder of what everyone avoided remembering, that even the purest light was once afraid of itself, that even the sun has doubted its own brightness. And in that forgotten space, truth hovered without interference, a kind of truth that doesn't need to be explained, just felt. It was at this place that a young priest named Kaido decided to spend the night, not out of defiance, but out of quiet curiosity. He had heard the story of Amaterasu since he was a child, but he wanted to feel for himself what that absence meant. He climbed alone, without rushing, carrying only a lantern, a blanket, and a small bronze mirror that belonged to his grandmother. He reached the top at dusk. The wind was gentle, but steady. The sky was clear, and the silence was thick, not threatening, but absolute. Kaido sat down on a smooth rock and just stayed. He looked at the horizon, but he wasn't expecting any vision. He just wanted to be there, present, Night fell slowly. The stars appeared one by one, as if arriving without making a noise, and with them came a strange feeling. Don't be afraid, but he felt a longing that he didn't know where it came from, a feeling of something lost, but still pulsing somewhere. He placed the mirror on the floor, next to his body, and lay down looking at the sky. Little by little, thoughts began to emerge, not as voices, but as sensations. He remembered his childhood, when he would watch the sun rise with his father, before he disappeared without explanation. He remembered the first time he heard Amaterasu's name, and how he thought she was made only of light, without flaws. He remembered the first time he felt unable to live up to the expectations others had of him. And there, lying in the darkness of that forgotten mountain, he realized that perhaps everyone had their own cave. Perhaps the story of the goddess was not just a myth. Maybe it was a mirror. When sleep began to come, Kaito took hold of his grandmother's mirror and raised it towards the sky. The moon reflected there, soft, faint, and for an instant he saw his own face mixed with the lunar reflection. He smiled, not because he found an answer, but because he understood that there doesn't always need to be one. Sometimes being silent is enough, and with that light thought, he closed his eyes. He slept under the protection of a sacred absence, of a light that had disappeared and returned, leaving signs along the way for those who came after, gentle signs for whoever was willing to listen. The next morning, Kaito woke up with the first rays of sunlight touching his face, a faint, unhurried warmth, as if the day were stretching along with him. He sat up slowly, still half asleep, and looked around. The mountain looked exactly the same as the night before, but something in him had changed. His body felt lighter, his breathing deeper, and his mind, curiously, silent. He picked up the bronze mirror and looked at it calmly. Now it reflected the light of the rising sun, a calm light without arrogance, and he understood, right then and there, that this was a blessing. Not a grand revelation, nor a divine vision, just the simple certainty that there was room for everything, for absence, for return, for doubt, for silence. Kaito remained seated for a few more hours. I didn't want to rush the descent. I wanted to save that moment as much as possible. I wanted to engrave on my skin what it was like to be in a place marked by such an ancient history, and yet so present. He knew that when he returned to the village, no one expected any great reports. Maybe they didn't even believe it, but that didn't matter. What lived there did not need to be told out loud. It was enough to be carried in the way of looking, listening, breathing. This was what the story of Amaterasu had become over time, a quiet teaching, a gesture that spans centuries without needing to be explained. As he walked down the path, Amaterasu felt the movement from above. She knew that someone else had understood her journey, not as a legend, but as a possible path, and that kind of understanding cannot be seen. It can be perceived. It can be honored in silence. She continued her course through the heavens, as she did every day, but now each ray of sunlight she cast brought a bit of the shadow that had once sheltered her, not as a bitter memory, but as a part of herself, because she had understood. And now others were beginning to understand too. That light is only complete when it knows darkness. On Earth, new stories began to emerge. Stories of people who disappeared for a while and then came back different, calmer, more focused. They said they had gotten lost in forests, that they had dreamed of mirrors, that they had heard laughter where there was no one. No one knew exactly what was true and what was imagination, but there was a growing acceptance that disappearance was not always a mistake. Sometimes it was the beginning of healing, the beginning of a deep conversation between the soul and the world. And Amaterasu watched this attentively, did not intervene, just let it happen. I knew that true wisdom does not come with impositions but with small gestures that are repeated over time. Back in the sky, she maintained a serene rhythm. She woke the world gently, she warmed it slowly. Her mornings were longer now, and her sunsets were gentler. At night, she let the moon of Tsukuyomi take its place with dignity. There was no longer any dispute. There was no longer any urgency. Everyone had their role, their time, their space. And in this balance, the days went by more harmoniously. It was as if the universe had learned the hard way that even the oldest cycles can be rethought, that even the sacred can be renewed. And meanwhile, somewhere between the mountains and the sea, Susanoo pursued his own learning. He had not yet returned. He hadn't spoken to anyone yet, but the waters where he passed were calmer. The winds that blew no longer brought destruction. It was a different silence now, a silence that prepared the reunion, even if distant, even if delayed, because there are things that don't need to happen right away. Just know that they are moving, even if it's slow. And so, the story of Amaterasu and the Dark Cave ceased to be just a myth. It became a mirror, a guide, an invitation to the necessary silence that, one day, can lead us back to the light. Over the years, shrines dedicated to Amaterasu began to incorporate new rituals. Nothing grand, nothing involving crowds or elaborate offerings. They were simple ceremonies, performed in silence. The priests sat in front of small mirrors, as if waiting to hear something that cannot be said in words. There were no chants, no pleas. Just listen. And in this gesture, many found comfort, not because of what they saw in the reflection, but because of what they felt when they allowed themselves to look. The image returned by the mirror was not just a face, it was the memory of a light that once wavered, of a goddess who once hid. And yet, he came back. That, in itself, gave strength. Among these priests was a young woman named May. She grew up hearing the story of the Dark Cave, but she never believed it was just about Amaterasu. Ever since she was a child, she felt that there was something in that story that touched her own existence. She has always been sensitive to silence. When she was little, she would hide in closets to think. As she grew older, she preferred the sound of rain to the noise of conversations. So, when she began her training at the temple, no one was surprised by her affinity for the mirror ritual. It was as if she always knew what to do. She didn't explain, she just did it, and that was enough. One morning, May decided to climb alone to the old shrine that stood on the side of a forgotten hill. She took with her only a small mirror wrapped in thick cloth and a notebook in which she rarely wrote. When she reached the top, she brushed a flat stone with her hands, sat down, and placed the mirror on her knees. The sky was overcast, but there was no threat of rain. It was a calm gray, as if the world were on pause. May took a deep breath, looked at the reflection before her, and stayed there for long minutes, her eyes half closed, her face serene. She did not expect any apparition. She did not ask for a sign. She simply let time do what it does best, pass. And then, without waiting, something emerged from within, a memory, a time long ago when she had felt so alone, a day when no one had noticed that she needed help, and that memory came with a salty taste. May didn't cry, but her eyes stung. The mirror showed nothing but her own face. But in that moment, she understood the reason for the ritual. It was about allowing herself to see. No filter, no rush, no pretense. And that hurt, but it also freed. She closed her eyes and let the silence envelop her. She felt the wind brush through her arms, the faint scent of damp earth. And there, in that absolute stillness, he felt the presence of Amaterasu, not like a divine vision, not like a voice, but as a certainty, the same certainty you have when you are at home, when you know that even in silence, Someone is on the other side of the door. May smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, but full of meaning. At the end of the day, she walked slowly down the hill. She carried the mirror rolled up in her arms, more carefully than she had on the way up, not because it had changed, but because now she knew what it carried. More than a sacred object, it was a reminder that the sacred also hides itself sometimes, and that this does not make it less divine. On the contrary, it makes it closer. That day, May didn't tell anyone what she felt. She returned to the temple, did her chores, and slept in silence. But in the days that followed, something in her gaze changed. Others noticed. They said she seemed more present, more grounded, lighter, and maybe that was it. Maybe by gently touching her own darkness, she had lit a new light inside, a light that doesn't go out with the wind, that doesn't depend on the approval of others, a light that simply is. While May was experiencing her own discovery, something silent was also beginning to take shape. In the realm of the gods, the older kami, observers by nature, noticed that the cycle was completing itself in subtle ways. The story of Amaterasu was not just a memory, it was a moving mirror, reflected in those who were learning to deal with their own light and shadow. They gathered one evening around a blue fire that only immortals could see. There was no urgency, no agenda, just the desire to think together. Among them was Omoikane, the god of deep thought. He remained silent for a long time. Only after the sky had completely darkened did he speak. The cave has closed. Yes, but what it opened, inside and outside Amaterasu, is still expanding. No one answered, but everyone understood. Amaterasu's presence was different now, no longer centralizing, but radiating. She did not impose her brilliance. I just offered it, and this allowed other gods, until then silent, to begin to express themselves. Lesser gods, linked to introspection, pause, and emotional healing, began to be listened to more carefully. Before, they were seen as secondary. Now, they became essential, because Amaterasu's crossing had shown that balance does not come from strength. It comes from listening, from waiting, of silence well lived. And in this new symbolic space, everyone had something to say. At one of these celestial gatherings, a young god named Shikame stood up. He rarely spoke. He was the kami of the spaces between things, the pauses between words, the gaps between gestures, the silences that hold sound. He said, "While everyone celebrates the return of the light, I continue to listen to the cave. It still whispers." And with that, he stood, walked to the edge of the gathering, and disappeared into the mist. No one stopped him. They knew he had to go, that there were still parts of this story waiting to be understood. Meanwhile, on Earth, other humans like May began to seek out quiet places, not to escape the world, but to hear yourself better. Small groups formed around ancient wells, shallow caves, hidden clearings. They did not create doctrines, no temples. They just sat together and were. They watched the light fall on the stone. They listened to the sound of the leaves. They shared the silence, like someone sharing bread. And there, something blossomed, something that could not be named, but that, in all the hearts present, was felt. Amaterasu, from above, observed these movements with tenderness. She did not intervene. She did not guide. She simply accompanied. She knew that true transformation cannot be forced. It emerges in each person's own time, sometimes in absolute silence, other times in the middle of a dance, but always, always from an inner place that can only be accessed when one has the courage to face the darkness. And so, she kept her light constant, but not invasive, so that whoever wanted to could find their way back, without getting burned, without getting lost. The stars began to shine brighter that season. They said it was a sign that heaven was grateful, that darkness, even though it was harsh, taught more than 1,000 ages of uninterrupted light. And so, between gods and humans, a new form of reverence was formed, less noisy, more sensitive, and perhaps more true, because there is no stronger faith than that which understands that even the divine needs rest, that even the light, from time to time, needs to go out to remember why it shines. On that very night when the gods gathered and humans silently learned to listen to themselves, Amaterasu walked alone along the shores of heaven. There were no appointments made, no sacred places to visit. She just walked. The brightness around him was minimal, just enough to light the way beneath your feet. It was a simple gesture, but full of intention. To be present without dominating, being visible without being the center. This was her new way of occupying the world. As I walked, memories came with the breeze. The first time he saw Susanoo angry, the sound of stone sealing the cave, the fright of seeing your own image in the mirror, everything came back. But without the sharp pain, they were memories with frayed edges, like pages reread so many times they no longer hurt. They just whisper. She stopped before a heavenly lake. The surface was so smooth that it seemed like a continuation of the sky itself. He sat on the bank and watched. I didn't expect an answer. I wasn't looking for a sign. I just wanted to contemplate. And there, reflected in the water, she saw a version of herself that no longer existed, ancient Amaterasu, the one who thought that being strong meant never weakening, that being light was never disappearing. He looked for a long minute, and then he made a light gesture with his hand, as if saying goodbye to a loved one who needs to leave. The image fell apart, and the lake became just a lake again. At that exact moment, somewhere on Earth, a child woke up from a dream without understanding why. My heart felt calm, as if I had received a hug while I slept. That was it. A caress. But it would change her day without you noticing. And that, Amaterasu knew, was the best way to touch the world now. Without fuss, no major appearances. Just presence, like the sun on cloudy days. Even without being seen, it is still there, warming. Shikame, the god of pauses, continued his journey towards what remained of the ancient cave. It was a place that no one visited anymore. Not even the winds dared to pass through there, but he felt that something still needed to be heard. When he arrived, the large ceiling stone was still motionless, majestic, but there was moss growing in the cracks. Small flowers sprouted in the corners. Life, as always, found a way. Shikame approached, not reverently, but cautiously. He leaned his forehead against the stone and just listened. For hours, he heard no words, no voices, heard silence. A silence full of history, and that was more than enough. From up high, Amaterasu noticed her presence. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just felt, and in that feeling, she understood that her story now belonged to the world, not as a possession, but as a legacy. Everyone who approached the cave with respect heard a little of what she had experienced, not to repeat, but to transform. And that was the most beautiful thing, to see her pain become a bridge, her pause become a path, her shadow become light for others. And that's why she kept walking, without rushing, without a fixed destination, just present. Some gods said that she walked differently now, with the step of someone who has fallen and is no longer afraid of the ground, with the gaze of someone who knows that even the sky needs roots, and with the calm of someone who no longer needs to prove anything, because those who know their own darkness also know the way back, and that is enough. The following night, the sky was particularly clear, and the stars seemed to whisper to each other. Amaterasu sitting at the edge of the light, watched the silent dance of the constellations. There was something comforting about the regularity of the cosmos. Even after everything she had experienced, even after the cave, the stars still moved patiently. She sighed, not in sadness, but in acceptance. The world went on, and so did she. On the other side of the world, Susanoo walked through a solitary canyon. His steps were firm, but not hurried. He no longer ran away from his own echo. He had learned to live with it. He stopped in front of a tall rock, leaned his hand against it, and stayed there. He did not pray. He did not apologize. He simply acknowledged the space, as if visiting a memory. The wind blew past him, with a different sound now. It was no longer a lament, but a conversation, an exchange, as if the world was finally willing to listen to him, because he was finally willing to listen too. In his heart, there were still doubts. Would she forgive him? Would the time he had spent away be enough? But he had learned not to hold on to those questions anymore, to let them come and go like the tides. The answer, if it came, would come in her own time, and he had learned that a goddess's time is not measured in haste. Amaterasu felt his presence from a distance, like a light thread of wind that touches the skin without warning. He felt no pain, no joy, felt reality. His existence, despite everything, was still part of hers, and that wasn't something that would go away. It was like an old tattoo, sometimes forgotten, sometimes remembered, but always there. She didn't know if she wanted to meet him again, but I also no longer felt the need to avoid him. There was a balance to it, a silent truce, which, at that moment, was enough. The oldest kami watched everything with attentive eyes. They knew that something greater was taking shape, not a dramatic reunion, nor a theatrical reconciliation, but a new form of presence, a form where two forces, light and storm, could coexist without canceling each other out. And that, among gods, was rare. It required maturity. It required humility. It required silence. Omoikane, always attentive to subtle movements, said quietly to himself, "This is how the world changes. Not with explosions, but with small, continuous gestures." At the temple where May served, a new silent ceremony began to take shape. Every last night of the month, the villagers would gather around the sacred mirror, each bringing an object that represented an old pain, not to offer it, nor to destroy it, but to look at it as a group, in silence. It was a simple, almost invisible practice, but it gradually transformed the village. People talked more calmly, children slept better, the elderly smiled more with their eyes than with their lips, and May knew why. Amaterasu's shadow had taken root there, not as regret, but as wisdom. And so, in different parts of the world, echoes of the cave spread in dreams, in gestures, in silences. Each person approached this story in a different way, some with tears, others with laughter, but all with a common feeling. We are not alone in our darkness. Someone has been there, someone has returned, and if she could do it, perhaps we can too. And it was then, when the silence between gods and men seemed to have become a new language, that the unexpected happened. Not a loud event, nor a grandiose sign, but a gesture, a small choice, but full of meaning. Susanoo, after years of walking the corners of the world, took a new direction, a step, not guided by escape, nor by despair, a step towards the sky, not to the palace of the gods, not to the halls of power, but to an ancient clearing, close to the sealed entrance to the cave where it all began. He did not want to invade. He did not want to open what was closed. He just wanted to be close, like someone who visits a sacred place and asks permission from the ground. When he got there, he sat down in front of the stone. He didn't speak. He didn't touch it. He just closed his eyes and stayed. It was the same gesture that so many humans were now practicing, listening without wanting to change anything, And in that silence, something inside him dissolved, an old anger, a pent-up sadness, a guilt, chewed over in silence for too long. It was no longer about forgiveness. It was about recognition, about understanding that he couldn't fix the past, but he could honor the present with presence. Amaterasu, from above, noticed, not with her eyes, but with her entire body. She felt the vibration of that gesture like a soft note echoing in time, and it didn't generate alarm, nor an immediate reaction, just an internal nod, as if to say, I know. And this knowing, between siblings, was enough at that moment. She didn't need to come down. He didn't need to come up. That link, tenuous and sincere, remade in silence, was enough. Shikame, who was still walking along the paths of the old cave, found Susanoo sitting there. He said nothing. He just sat beside him. For hours, the two of them stayed there, as sentinels of what had passed, but also guardians of what could be born. Between them, no judgment, no demands, only respect for the path taken to get there. When Shikame stood up, he left behind a small, smooth stone, engraved with a spiral, a symbol of cycles, of the turns that time takes. Susanoo held the stone firmly, but said nothing. There was no need. On Earth, in a remote village, a girl was drawing something on the ground with a twig. Without knowing why, she was drawing spirals, one inside the other, as if her body knew a movement that her mind did not yet understand. Her grandmother watched from afar and smiled. She is listening, she thought, not with her ears, but with her soul, because sometimes knowledge arrives before words, and among children, this knowledge is lighter, cleaner. Amaterasu watched everything, not with pride, not even with sadness, but with serenity, like someone who sees what they planted begin to blossom. Not big flowers, no immediate fruits, but seeds sown in time. And that was enough, because now she knew, not every healing has to be complete. Sometimes, the most important thing is to just get started. Make space, let the light in slowly, and also allow the shadow to stay a little bit. No fear. The clearing in front of the cave, once forgotten, became a place of shared silence. Gods passed by there to breathe. Humans dreamed of that place, without knowing why. The space asked for nothing. It simply offered presence, and that, for those who have suffered, is the greatest gift. The clearing before the dark cave, now silently inhabited, became a point of balance between the worlds. It was neither a temple nor an altar, but it attracted people. Some came in body, others in thought. Some passed by without knowing why, just feeling that they should stop. It was a place where no one asked, but everyone received something. Sometimes a rest, sometimes a light answer, and other times just the right to have no answer at all. It was in this space that Susanoo decided to stay for a while, not to watch, not even to be seen, but to learn to remain, something I never knew how to do. He, who had always been in movement, now experienced stillness, and I discovered there was a lot of power in not doing. On break, not to be. The first few nights were strange. His body wanted to act, to create, to run. His mind asked for explanations. He wanted to know if he was being observed, judged, measured. But time, as always, softened these edges. As the days passed, he began to release the tension in his chest. His hands stopped closing. His eyes stopped seeking approval. And when he finally surrendered to the simple act of being there, he began to notice new things. The sound that the stones make when they cool down at dusk, the rhythm of the leaves falling slowly, the breathing of the earth. It was as if the world, little by little, accepted him back, not as a storm god, but as a being. Amaterasu watched this from afar. She never got too close, but she didn't move away either. There was a safe distance between the two, where the bond could exist without pain. A space that was not yet a reunion, but was no longer a separation. And this in-between space was precious, because there was respect, there was maturity, and most importantly, there was choice. Nothing there was forced. Everything was a presence constructed with care. In heaven, the other gods went their separate ways. Some still preferred grandeur, others began to adopt silence. As a form of prayer, the wisdom of pause spread slowly, like water infiltrating the earth, and little by little, everything changed. Decisions became more considered, judgments gentler, haste less celebrated. It was a subtle but irreversible transformation, because when the sacred learns to breathe deeply, the whole world learns along with it. On earth, May led a new generation of apprentices at the temple. She never called herself a teacher. She preferred to be called the guardian of the mirror. She taught little with words. She preferred gestures, listening, not knowing. One of her favorite rituals was to sit in a circle with the young people and ask a single question. What do you still not understand about yourself? Each person would be silent for a few minutes. Some would write, others would just close their eyes, and no one had to answer out loud. It was the process that mattered, not the conclusion. One afternoon, one of the younger apprentices asked May if Amaterasu still felt sadness. May thought for a moment, then replied, "Maybe, but now she knows she can feel it and move on. She doesn't have to run away anymore." The girl was silent for a long time. Then she smiled. That was it. Knowing that even a goddess feels it, and yet moves on, was a lesson that no book could teach. In the clearing, Susanoo began to pile up small stones next to the large ceiling rock. It wasn't a monument, not a single request. It was just a gesture, a way of saying, "I was here, I stopped." Each stone carried a thought, a regret, a memory. Over time, the mound grew, and no one dared to touch him, not even the wind. The pile of stones in front of the cave did not grow quickly. Susanoo piled them up one at a time, unhurriedly, as if he were writing a verse on the ground. Each stone was different. Some were smooth, others porous. Some were larger, others the size of a finger. He did not choose them based on aesthetic criteria. He chose them based on their weight, their texture, what he felt when he held them. It was a work of listening, not of construction. And this gesture, repeated day after day, transformed the space around it. The birds came closer. The wind blew more gently. Even the clouds seemed to slow down as they passed overhead. There was a vibration of care, of restraint, as if time had learned to respect that silence. One day, Shikame returned to the clearing. He sat next to Susanoo and watched the stones. He didn't comment on anything. He just picked up one of the smaller ones and placed it on top of the pile. It was the only time he participated. Then he stood up, bowed slightly, and left without looking back. Susanoo understood. That was an acknowledgement, a seal, a reminder that even in a fallen state, a god can still create something that sustains the world, and that he would keep to himself. On the other side of the sky, Amaterasu continued her circular walk, but now, at certain moments, she would stop for longer moments. She would watch villages sleeping, children playing in water mirrors, old people sitting in the shade, their eyes lost on the horizon. And in those moments, she felt something she had never known before, peace. Not the peace of someone who wins a war, but the peace of someone who has learned not to fight against themselves. Her light, in those moments, was more golden, more filtered, and those who lived under her light noticed, even without knowing why. Their hearts beat more serenely. The days seemed less heavy, and their dreams lighter. One morning, Amaterasu appeared in the clearing, not as a shining goddess, but as a human figure, dressed in simple white, without adornment. Susanoo was asleep. She did not wake him. She simply approached the pile of stones and observed it. She remained there for a few minutes. Then she picked up a small stone that was on the ground, held it between her fingers, and felt its weight. She thought about leaving it on top, but changed her mind. Instead, she placed it on the ground, next to the first one, almost hidden, and she smiled, because not every presence needs to be visible. At dawn, Susanoo woke up and saw the new stone. There was no sign of who left it, but he knew. And that knowledge did not come with strong emotion. There was no tear, not even euphoria. It was just presence, like the smell of the earth after the rain, like the sound of a bird in the distance. He looked up at the sky, where the light was just beginning to paint the day, and murmured, "Thank you." I didn't expect an answer, and there was no need. The gesture was already the answer. In May's village, the young apprentices began a new ritual. Instead of just mirrors, they began bringing stones to the monthly gatherings. Each person chose a stone that symbolized something they had carried during the month. A fear, a doubt, a guilt. They placed the stones in the center of the circle, in silence. Then, at the end of the ceremony, they returned them to nature. They threw them in the river, buried them under a tree, left them on trails. It was a way of practicing detachment, of saying, "I felt it, but now I let it go." And so, what began in the clearing spread throughout the world, without a poster, without preaching, just by example. The hill in front of the cave grew slowly, but each stone had a story, each one a moment, and even if one day time erased everything, the gesture would remain in the fabric of the world, because what is done with truth is never lost. And that's how the Dark Cave, which was once a symbol of absence, became a point of transformation, a place where you enter to disappear, and from where you come back different, or just turn around. Over time, the clearing in front of the cave began to receive silent visitors. There weren't many, there were never many, and they rarely came together, but they did come. Some alone, some guided by dreams, some just because they felt they had to go. None of them spoke loudly. None of them took pictures. It was as if the very air around them asked for delicacy. They would approach the pile of stones, stand for a while, then sit down. Sometimes they would cry. Sometimes they would just close their eyes. And other times, they would just touch a stone and leave. There was no guidance, no priest, no manual, just their presence, and that was enough. Susanoo was still nearby. He was neither a guide nor a host. He didn't ask names. I just watched. Sometimes he offered water, others just a nod, and every now and then, when he noticed someone particularly lost, he would tell part of the story, never whole, just enough. It said, "She came in because she needed to," or "Not every escape is weakness," or even, "Sometimes the stone that closes also protects," and whoever listened understood, not with the mind, but with the body, because that clearing didn't explain. She let it be felt. One night, an older woman arrived, her steps slow but determined. He carried a leather bag on his back with just one object, an old mirror broken at the corner. As she approached the pile of stones, Susanoo watched her, not with strangeness, but with calm curiosity. She knelt down, took the mirror out of her bag, and placed it on the ground, in front of the stone where Amaterasu had left her gesture. He stayed there for long minutes. Then he took the mirror and turned it to face himself. He looked, he touched the crack with his finger, and he smiled, a sad smile, but full of acceptance. Susanoo approached slowly. He sat down next to her. He didn't ask anything. "She spoke first," he said. "For a long time, I thought this crack was a defect, Today I see that it is where the light comes in. He just nodded. They stood in silence together. And at that moment, he felt that there was something of Amaterasu in that woman, not in the face, nor in the voice, but in the courage to look at you without a filter. And for a moment, it was like he was there with his sister again, not the goddess, but the one who entered the cave one day and had to forget who she was to remember who she could be. After the woman left, Susanoo looked at the mountain. He thought of the first stone. He thought of all the others. And then he got up, walked to the edge of the clearing, and picked up a new one. It was a thin stone, with a dark line cutting it down the middle. As he placed it on top of the hill, he felt something different, as if, finally, he was ready to leave that vigil, not because the work was finished, but because now he knew the glade took care of you, and the story was already moving forward on its own 2 feet in the sky. Amaterasu felt the gesture, didn't look directly, but he allowed his light that morning to touch the clearing with a softer warmth, the type of light that does not require movement, that just says, I'm here. And for anyone who has ever had to hide, this is the most valuable of all, a light that does not press, that just accompanies. That's how the dark cave stopped being an end. It became a crossing, it became a path, and even without words, it taught us that hiding is not the same as disappearing, that returning is not the same as forgetting, and that sometimes it is in silence that we rediscover what matters most. That morning, when the sun touched the clearing more tenderly, something subtle changed in the landscape. Wildflowers that used to grow discreetly in corners began to spread more boldly, small, pale in color, but determined. It was as if the soil was responding to the constant presence, to the emotions deposited there, to the stories told in silence. And those who came, even without understanding botany or mythology, understood. They felt that place was alive, not with the bustling life of the cities, but with an ancient, deep life that pulses beneath the earth and can only be heard when everything falls silent. May once climbed up to the clearing, not with a group, not as a ceremony, alone. She needed to see with her own eyes what so many had reported. When she arrived, she found the pile of stones intact, but different, denser, more complete. She sat in front of it and just breathed. She stayed there for hours. She didn't write. She didn't analyze. She just stayed. In the afternoon, she approached the stone where, so they said, Amaterasu had left a gesture. There was no clear sign, but she knew, because the body recognizes what the mind has not yet named. She touched her fingers to the ground next to the stone and felt warmth, not physical, but a kind of welcoming vibration, as if the ground were saying, everything is okay. On the way down, May carried a single stone with her, not for keeping, but to deliver. Upon arriving at the temple, he washed the stone, dried it with a white cloth, and placed it in front of the mirror, not as an offering, but as continuity. It was his way of uniting what he saw up there with what he taught down here, and from that day on, he began to say a new phrase to his apprentices. Each one has his own cave, and each cave its own time. It was not an instruction. It was a memory, a reminder that the process of disappearing and returning is older than any prayer. Meanwhile, Susanoo had left the clearing. No one saw his departure. No one needed to see. They only noticed, days later, that the footprints had disappeared and that, next to the mound, there was one last stone, different from the others. It was dark, smooth, and had something engraved on it. No words, just a spiral, simple and perfect. That said it all. It was the end of his vigil and the beginning of another phase. Wherever he was now, he was still part of history, not as a mistake, but as a link. Amaterasu, from above, continued her circular journey through the heavens, but now, at certain moments, he would look directly at the clearing, not with melancholy, not even with longing, but with gratitude. What began as an escape had become a meeting place, and that was more than she could have imagined. The cave, once a shelter of pain, was now a source of wisdom, and everyone who passed by left with something new. Sometimes they didn't even know what it was, but they felt they came back more whole, closer to you. It was at this stage that some people began to write songs about the cave. Songs without a chorus, without end, just circular melodies meant to be played around campfires or whispered to oneself as one falls asleep. They said that singing these songs helped them find their own rhythm. And, who knows, the silence itself. Amaterasu would hear these melodies when she crossed the skies at night and smile because the light she had taken from the world in a moment of pain was now returning in ways she could never have imagined, softer, wider, and perhaps more true. Over time, these circular songs spread through the villages, the forests, and even into the homes of those who had never heard of the Dark Cave. No one knew who composed the first. They said they came from the ground, from the wind, from dreams. They were melodic, but soft. They were played on simple instruments, bamboo flutes, thin-skinned drums, small bells. They were not taught formally. They were learned by repetition, by listening slowly. Children sang them before going to sleep, and the elderly sang them on their solitary walks. Each verse was a whisper of time, an echo of what Amaterasu had left behind when she returned. And all the while, the clearing was changing. But not physically. It remained small, surrounded by trees and rocks. The mound grew slowly, but the space around it seemed to expand inside those who arrived. There was a kind of listening that permeated words. No questions were asked, but all seemed to be answered. One day, a young woman with no name arrived at the clearing after walking for weeks. No one knew her. She wore a small shell around her neck and carried a cloth tied around her waist. She sat in front of the mound and remained there for 3 days. On the third day, she took off the shell, placed it on the ground, whispered something inaudible, and left. Around her, the silence seemed denser, as if that gesture had altered something invisible. Those who came later felt the change, but no one touched the shell. It remained there, among the rocks, without explanation. In the heavens, Amaterasu continued to watch, and now she was beginning to remember herself in the cave, not with pain, but with a kind of tenderness, like someone looking at an old photo. He didn't erase what he had experienced, but I also didn't need to revive anymore. It was part of history, and every story, when well lived, becomes a path that she had understood. That light is not constant because it never fails, but because it always returns, even if by other means, even if by other hands. On a peaceful evening, she stopped in front of the celestial lake, the same surface where she had seen her old image before. Now, she saw another, not just the current one, but a series of faces, like overlapping reflections. Amaterasu as a child, Amaterasu as a goddess, Amaterasu exhausted, Amaterasu hidden, Amaterasu returning. All of them there, all of them still her. They were not phases to be overcome. They were layers that now knew how to coexist. And so, for the first time, she did not look away. She did not shrink. She just stayed and smiled. In the human world, a new practice began to emerge. Small groups would gather in open spaces at dawn, in silence, just to watch the sunrise, not out of blind devotion, but out of remembrance, the memory that that sun no longer shone, and yet he came back and come back every day. It was a way of saying, we are here, a way of saying, we still choose the light. Some carried small mirrors, others just had their eyes open, but everyone, without exception, felt something at that moment when the first ray touched the skin. It was more than hot. It was recognition, the certainty that, despite everything, we continue. And so, without fanfare, without dogma, the story of Amaterasu ceased to be just a myth. It became a breath. It became practice. It became a way of being in the world, each one with his cave, each one with his own way of living, each one with his own stone on the mountain. The morning after one of these dawn vigils, a white-haired lady sat on top of a hill, watching the sun rise, with a round mirror on her lap. Beside her, a child, perhaps her granddaughter, perhaps just a neighbor, imitated her gestures, with a small mirror made of cheap metal. The two said nothing. The silence between them was old and comfortable. When the first ray of light touched the lady's mirror, she smiled slightly and looked at the girl. See, he always comes back. The child nodded, as if she already knew, because there are things that even the youngest understand, without having to go through everything. And this knowledge, when transmitted without burden, takes root more firmly. Meanwhile, in a remote temple in the mountains, a new ceremony was being created. It had no name. It had no altar, just an open tent with cushions on the floor and a mirror suspended in the center. People entered alone. They stayed as long as they wanted. Some cried, others just breathed. When they left a stone at the entrance, and so, little by little, the memory of the cave took on new forms, not as a replica, but as a reverberation. Each space, a listening, each gesture, a continuation. In the sky, Amaterasu followed her path, and on certain days, she let her glow soften even more, as if to say, you don't need to look at me to feel me. It was a new confidence, a detachment from the role. Before, being the sun was a mission. Now, it was a choice, a conscious, present choice. And that changed everything, because when the light offers itself, without imposing itself, it becomes shelter, not a demand. And many began to notice this. The heat was no longer the same. It was more directed, more tender. It touched, but did not demand. It warmed, but did not burn. Shikame, the god of pauses, returned to roam the lands of men. No one recognized him, but those who crossed his path said they felt something strange, a momentary forgetfulness of haste, a sudden relief, as if time had stopped for a second. He smiled discreetly when he heard this. He knew that his function had never been to be seen, but to remember that the interval between one thing and another is also sacred, that the silence between words, the space between notes, the emptiness between gestures, all of this has power. And now, after Amaterasu's crossing, the world was more willing to listen to this kind of teaching. At May's temple, the older apprentices began to guide the younger ones with more autonomy, and she, more and more, just watched. He intervened little. It fixed almost nothing. Did you know that true learning comes from contact with one's own reflection, and the most effective mirror is not the one that shows your face, but what reveals what was hidden? One night, a young apprentice asked, "What if I'm never ready to leave my cave?" May replied, "Then make it your home for a while. Light is not for expelling. It is for warmth." The young man said nothing, but the next morning, he brought a new stone and placed it in front of the mirror, and that was enough. In the original clearing, the pile of stones continued to grow slowly. Sometimes no new stones would appear for weeks. Other times, 2 or 3 would appear in the same night. Nobody controlled. No one explained. It was a flow of its own, and each stone there had a weight that was not measured in grams. It was the weight of what was left, of what was recognized, of what was transformed. And even without signs, without priests, without guardians, everyone who arrived knew what to do. Because there, silence instructed, presence was enough. The story spoke for itself. The story of the Dark Cave was no longer just a tale passed down between temples and shrines. It had spread like a breath, like a breeze crossing the fields, penetrating the simplest houses, the most contained thoughts. There was no single version, and no one cared about accuracy. Some said that Amaterasu cried the entire time she was hidden. Others said he slept, that he dreamed of a world where no one needed to shine all the time. Others still believed that she transformed inside the cave and came out not as she was before, but as she really wanted to be. And none of these versions were wrong, because they all spoke of something essential: the courage to retreat, and the even greater challenge of returning. In more remote villages, storytellers began to include longer pauses when talking about Amaterasu. Between one section and another, they fell silent, not by forgetfulness, but out of respect for listening time. The audience, in turn, did not interrupt. I knew that in that space between the words, there was something to be felt, something that can't always be said. The children, who had been impatient before, now listened in silence, as if something inside them also knew the importance of giving space, as if, even without understanding everything, they recognized in the goddess not only the source of light, but also the right to darkness. May, upon learning this, spent a few minutes looking at the mirror in her temple. Then she wrote a single sentence in her notebook. The pause is also a narrative. She didn't explain it. She didn't read it to the others. She just left it there. And days later, one of the apprentices found it, and without knowing who had written it, added right below it, and every narrative can also rest. Thus, the notebook became a collective book, without an owner, without order, just voices that recognized each other, one by one on the margins of the myth. Amaterasu, watching all this from above, felt a silent gratitude, not for being remembered, but for being understood. There was something deeply comforting in knowing that one's own vulnerability had become a point of support for others, not for the pain itself, but for the crossing, for the permission, for the choice to have stopped and then chosen to continue. Not always stronger, but always more real. In the clearing, now surrounded by moss and small flowers, visitors began to decrease, not by forgetfulness, but because many had already learned to find the clearing within themselves. The pile of stones remained there, firm, discreet. At night, I was touched by a soft light, as if the sky knew where to shine, and each new ray was not just light. It was memory. It was listening. It was presence. One morning, a boy arrived alone. There was a restless gleam in his eyes, but in his body, a deep exhaustion. He sat down, looked at the mountain, and did not cry, just breathed. He stayed there until dawn. Then, he took a small piece of wood from his pocket and placed it on the stones. It wasn't a stone. It didn't follow the pattern, but he felt it was right. When he left, the wind blew hard for a few seconds, and anyone who passed by afterwards swore that the splinter was still there, even days later, untouched, respected, and that's how the clearing continued. Not growing, not shrinking, just being, a fixed point on the map of the invisible, a silent landmark in the heart of those who learn, day after day, that disappearing can be part of the path, that stopping is also a gesture, and that light, to be true, needs to accept its own shadow. On those days when the moon seemed closer to Earth, illuminating the trails and silencing thoughts, the memory of the cave became even more vivid for those who walked alone. It was as if, under the light of the moon, which is never one's own, but rather a reflection of the sun. Everyone could remember Amaterasu more clearly, not the perfect goddess, nor the distant luminous entity, but the woman who needed to retreat, who, faced with excess, chose emptiness, who, faced with the noise, opted for silence, and the moon, an accomplice in this memory, seemed to approve, because she herself knew the cycles well. Did you know there is beauty in appearing and disappearing, and that each phase has its right time? On a distant island, where the winds whisper forgotten names, an old builder began to make stone mirrors. They did not reflect images clearly, but they slightly blurred the face of whoever was looking, to remember that not everything we see is everything we are, he said. Nobody would hire him, nobody ordered it, but every now and then, someone would find one of the mirrors on trails or by streams, and whoever found it rarely returned it, because somehow they knew they had been found too. The old man never explained where the inspiration came from. He only said that one day he had dreamed of a woman sitting in front of a rock, smiling without showing her teeth. In the celestial halls, the gods said little about all this, but many had changed their own habits. Meetings became shorter, pauses longer, decisions more heartfelt. Even disputes, once filled with pride, now involved more listening. It was as if the story of the cave had infiltrated the divine structure without needing to force its way in. It was simply being an example, a living reminder that the power that respects silence is more lasting than that which imposes itself by shouting. Amaterasu observed these changes with affectionate distance. She no longer participated in everything. She chose where to be, who to talk to, when to shine more or less. And this freedom was new. Before, she confused presence with obligation. Now, she understood that choosing where to be is also a way of loving. And with this understanding, her shine changed. It remained strong, but it was no longer imposing. It was closer, like a fireplace. It warms without blinding, and whoever came close felt it in their bone, not in their skin. One day, she received a visit from a figure she had not seen for a long time. Tsukuyomi, the lunar brother, silent by nature, distanced by old disagreements. He did not ask to meet. He simply showed up. He brought with him a small ceramic cup and a warm sake. He offered it to her. They sat in silence. They did not talk about the past. They did not reopen old wounds. They simply shared the moment. And in that shared cup, there was more reconciliation than in 1,000 apologies, because time, when respected, does its own work. And sometimes, what seems distant just waits for the right moment to get closer again. At the end of the meeting, Tsukuyomi handed her a small mirror fragment. It was matte, almost without shine, but when it touched the light, it reflected a faint ray, as if to say, "I am still here." Amaterasu accepted it with reverence, not as a gift, but as a symbol that even the pieces that seemed lost could be part of the light, and that, at that moment, was all I needed. With the mirror fragment in her hands, Amaterasu felt something she had not felt for a long time. It was not joy or longing. It was a feeling of reuniting with a forgotten part of herself, something that did not shine as brightly as the rest, but that, for that very reason, was more genuine. She kept the fragment next to her clothes, close to her chest, and went on her way without saying a word. In the following days, as it cast its light over the fields and oceans, this light carried a new lightness, as if now it also shone for those who could not, as if with each sunrise it said, "I am here, and you can be here too, in your own way." Meanwhile, at May's temple, mirrors began to be used differently. They were no longer seen merely as objects of meditation, but as bridges. Each apprentice had a small personal mirror, and once a month, they would gather around the temple's central stone and exchange their mirrors for a day. The rule was simple: take care of the other person's reflection as if it were your own. And during those 24 hours, each one saw something different: a scar that wasn't theirs, an unexpected smile, a look that carried stories they didn't know. And in that simple gesture, empathy was born, respect was born, and most importantly, listening was born. In the clearing, the pile of stones continued to grow, but now a new practice has emerged. Some visitors, upon arriving, did not just leave stones. They also left small mirrors, not all whole, some cracked, others stained by time, and they didn't put them on top. They placed themselves at the foot of the great rock, in silence, as if to say, "This is the reflection I carry, and I leave it here to be seen without judgment." Nobody touched them, no one moved them, and even the most broken ones remained there, reflecting fragments of the sky, the vegetation, the face of those who approached. And little by little, the clearing transformed into a place where everyone could be whole, even in their pieces. In a coastal village, a fisherman who had never heard the story of the cave began, out of habit, to talk to the sea every time he went out to fish. I didn't ask for anything, just talking. He told what he had dreamed, what he had felt, what he remembered about his mother, and, interestingly, the fish came in abundance. Not because they were magicians, but because his silence was honest, because there are forces in the world that respond better to presence than to demand, and without knowing it, that fisherman was also touching on the myth of Amaterasu. Not with words, but with gesture, with truth. Amaterasu felt these small movements, these resonances. She knew she no longer needed to be worshipped. What she really wanted, and had always wanted, was to be understood, not as a perfect symbol, but as a real presence, with fatigue, with difficult choices, with fragile returns. And now, more than ever, this was happening in simple gestures, in shared silences, in gazes that did not look away. The world was no longer the same, and neither was she. One afternoon, as she passed over a mountain she usually avoided, Amaterasu stopped. The wind was calm. The vegetation was low. It was the place where, long ago, she had last met Susanoo, before the chaos. She stood there for a few minutes. She looked at the ground. She felt the weight of memory, and then, for the first time, she smiled at the thought of him. Not a smile of forgetfulness, but of acceptance, because forgiveness, she now understood, was not about wiping away the past. It was about letting it breathe. And in that moment, the sun shone brighter for a brief moment. Then it returned to its serene tone, and life went on. Over the years, many began to call that serene glow of Amaterasu light without demands, a kind of clarity that didn't say, "Look at me," but whispered, "You can rest here." And that changed everything, because most lights in the world charge something: visibility, attention, movement. But that light, no, it just existed, and because it existed without demands, it became a home. In some villages, the elders began to say that when the sun seems more timid, more gentle, it is because Amaterasu is passing by in human form. That on those days, we should speak more quietly, eat calmly, leave the door ajar, not out of superstition, but out of respect, out of politeness. And this custom began to spread, of slower mornings, of meals in silence, of small gestures that require nothing more than presence. In the clearing, the mirrors left at the foot of the hill began to fog up, not because of dirt, but for time. The moisture from the earth rose to the edges. The moss approached, and the glass gained a light, almost poetic film. Nobody cleaned them. No one removed them. That was part of it. They were reflections that no longer needed to be sharp. Just being there was enough, like the memory of a face that doesn't need to be exact to be felt, like a good memory that can be diffuse but never disappear. One night, during a rare eclipse, the entire sky went dark for a few minutes. It was a total eclipse, the kind that affects the body and soul. In various parts of the world, people looked up and remembered the cave. It was inevitable, because seeing the sun disappear, even if only for a moment, was like watching history reenacted, only in the sky. Many sat down, others lay down on the ground, and when the sun returned, there was no applause, no shouting. There was a collective sigh, an acknowledgement. The world had remembered, for a brief moment, that light is also absence, and that absence is not the end. May, feeling the eclipse approaching, summoned the apprentices, but not for rituals, just to be together. They sat in a circle, each with a mirror, covered with a cloth. When the sky darkened, no one looked up. They looked inside, and when the light returned, they took off the fabrics. Each mirror reflected a different expression. Some faces had tears, others smiles, but everyone, without exception, had something new in their eyes, something that only arises when you cross the shadow with courage and calm. Susanoo, who had strayed from the familiar path, felt the eclipse as a call, not a call back, but a reminder that he was part of history, even if far away. And in that moment, sitting on the edge of a river, he understood that he no longer needed to wait for anyone's forgiveness, that it was enough to continue being present, being wind, being water that does not destroy, but molds. And in that internal gesture, a stone slipped from above and fell gently into the river. He smiled. Time continued to speak, and now he listened. Amaterasu, in turn, went through the eclipse with her eyes closed, not out of fear, but out of respect for the cycle itself. He felt the darkness, like an old friend who comes to visit, sits next to him, and says nothing. And when the light came back on, you opened your eyes and just said to yourself, yes, because sometimes the most powerful ritual is simply accepting that everything has its time, even the shadow, until the light, and mainly the silence between the two. After the eclipse, the nights became quieter for a while, as if the whole world was still digesting what it had experienced in that brief moment of darkness. It wasn't fear, it was something deeper, a collective pause, like the sigh one takes after remembering something forgotten. And in this silence, other gestures emerged. In some villages, they began to leave bowls of water on the windowsill at night. They said it was to reflect the sky, even when no one was looking. It was a way of saying, we are here, even in the dark. And these quiet waters, reflecting moons, stars, and shadows, also became mirrors, not of glass, but of presence. In one of these villages, a boy named Haru left one of these bowls on the windowsill, not because someone told him to, but because he had a dream. In the dream, a woman sat in front of the water and said, the light also rests. Haru didn't understand everything, but he woke up with the certainty that he had to do this. And the next morning, he saw that in the water of the bowl, there was a golden glow, a leaf floating like a boat, and a mosquito standing still, without moving. He watched for long minutes, without getting tired, because there, in that fragment of the world, there was everything he needed: movement, pause, and presence. Amaterasu saw this, felt. He smiled, not because it was a tribute, but because it was continuity. The light no longer needed to come from her alone. Now it flowed in small gestures, in human hands, in gazes that stop, and this was more than any temple, because what is alive spreads, not to dominate, but to belong. And she, more than a goddess, wanted this, to belong to the world, not as a symbol, but as a possibility. At May's temple, apprentices began to create small lanterns made of clay and wax. Each lantern bore a different inscription, chosen by the person making it. Short phrases, some incomplete, others almost whispered, "It's safe here. You can stop. It's okay for it to be dark." They were lit at dusk and left everywhere, on the steps, in the hallways, among the stones in the garden. And at night, the temple was no longer a place of light. It was a place softly inhabited by lights that did not compete with one another, each with its own rhythm, each with its own truth. In the clearing, the hill continued to grow, but now it was beginning to spread, not just up, but to the sides, as if the stories left there needed more space, and the ground accepted it. The surrounding trees leaned a little more, the branches spread out like arms, and even the birds made less noise. When they flew by, it was as if every place was learning to be a temple, not by construction, but by listening. On a calm evening, an unknown woman arrived at the clearing, carrying a bamboo basket in her arms. Inside were pieces of mirror, all different, cracked, worn, some almost opaque. She sat down, opened the basket, and one by one scattered the fragments around the pile. She said nothing. Then she took a cloth, wiped her hands, and left. The next person didn't touch anything. They just walked carefully among the fragments, and in each piece, she saw a different reflection, a piece of the sky, a trace of her own face, a glow from some memory. That wasn't decoration. It was a memory that you don't have to be whole to reflect something beautiful. And there, each shard told a story. Amaterasu passed over the clearing that night, saw the fragments, saw the reflections. He saw that his story now lived there, not as legend, but as practice, as a way of being. And he took a deep breath. Then he softened his glow, so that the night would arrive with more sweetness, because he knew, in that land, now, there was enough light. Even when everything goes dark, the following days were marked by a special stillness. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from absence, but the kind that comes when everything is where it should be, a full silence, alive, like the sound of a river flowing underground. And that feeling started to spread, not as a doctrine, nor as a message, but as a feeling, a state of mind that was manifested in people's gestures, in the rhythms of the villages, in the way bodies rested under the sun. It was as if the world, remembering the story of the cave, had decided to breathe a little more slowly, and in that calmer breathing, everything seemed to make more sense. Amaterasu followed this closely. She no longer needed to intervene. She only had to observe. Her role was different now, not to illuminate the force, but to maintain a constant, discreet, underlying warmth, like a blanket that cannot be seen but is always there. She understood that this new era was made of simple gestures, of those who wake up and decide, just for today, not to rush, of those who listen before responding, of those who look at the sky and remember that even the sun had to stop one day. And this memory, so subtle, was powerful because it freed, because it said, "You can do it too." In the village of Haru, the Bull Boy, children began to hold circles of silence at dusk. They would gather by the river, sit in a circle, and just listen. They listened to the sounds around them. They listened to their own bodies. They listened to the leaves, the water, the other. Nobody was in charge. Nobody organized. It was spontaneous, and perhaps that's why it's so true. One day, a curious old man went to observe. He sat with them. At first, he thought it was strange, but after a few minutes, he felt his body go limp, thoughts let loose. And there, among the children, He understood that he was learning to listen again, not with the ears, but with the soul. May, upon learning about these circles of silence, smiled to herself. She wrote in the temple notebook, "When history becomes a gesture, it becomes eternal." And she didn't tell anyone. She let the notebook do the work of spreading it, as it always did, slowly, deeply. Between one page and another, there were now words from many, phrases that sprang from direct experience. Today, I didn't need to run away from myself. My darkness also breathes. The calmest reflection was the one I didn't try to understand. It was a book with no beginning or end, no cover, but with weight, good weight, of someone who carefully carries that which is worth continuing. In the clearing, the mirror fragments began to cover themselves with fine spider webs. They were almost invisible in the daylight, but at night, under the moonlight, they became silver threads that danced in the wind. Someone tried to clean them once, but was stopped by another visitor. "They are also part of it," he said, and so they remained. The spiders, discreetly, did their work. They connected pieces of mirror, joined distant points, stitched together broken reflections. Without knowing it, they gave physical form to what history had already taught. Everything connects, even that which is in pieces, even that which seems forgotten. Susanoo, in another corner of the world, planted trees. Not many, just one at each place. I felt I should stop. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't sign. But every change I left was a request to stay, a reminder that the storm can also plant, and where these trees grew, people stopped. They sat in the shade. They felt something they couldn't name, and maybe they didn't need to, because there, in that green silence, a piece of the cave also lived, and Amaterasu, every day, passed through these places. It touched the earth with its calm light, and it continued. You didn't have to stay. The world now shone on its own. As time passed, the stories were no longer told only by those who remembered the cave. They began to emerge in other forms, in songs, in drawings in the sand, in patterns embroidered on ceremonial clothing. Each symbol, each verse, carried something from that journey, and even though not everyone could explain it, they felt that there was a truth there, as if the story had dissolved into everyday life, ceasing to be something distant, sacred, and untouchable, and becoming intimate, something that was lived, not recited. And this, in a silent way, was the greatest tribute they could pay to Amaterasu, to live in such a way that the light did not need to prove anything. It just was. In a village among the hills, a woman began writing letters that would not be delivered, letters to parts of herself that were lost over time. One for the girl who was scared, another for the young woman who ran away, another for the woman who survived in silence. And after each letter, he left a flower in the river. It wasn't a ritual. It wasn't a rule. It was just what the body asked for. And one day, one of these flowers was seen floating to the sea by a child who was playing alone. The child took the flower, put it in a glass bottle, and without really understanding why, whispered, "Go, find the person who wrote to you." The bottle followed, and somewhere, someone found her, and I knew it was for you. Amaterasu felt these small waves, like someone who feels the warmth of their own heart. She knew she had left something important behind in the cave, and now that something was blooming everywhere. It wasn't power, it wasn't domination, it was permission. Permission to stop, to feel, to shine only when she wanted to, and to darken when necessary. And it was this permission that the world seemed to be relearning little by little, with stumbles, but with truth. At May's temple, a new cycle began. Older apprentices began to create their own circles in other villages. They did not carry doctrine. They didn't have rules. They only took the mirror and the silence, and they let each place create its own way of listening. Some held conversation circles, others long walks without talking, others still just lay on the ground and looked at the sky together. That was it, finding your own way to inhabit what Amaterasu lived, not to be repeated, but to understand. In the clearing, the ground was barely visible anymore. The hill expanded as if it were part of the earth. The stones, the mirrors, the dry leaves, everything blended together naturally. There was no dividing line between what was left there and what grew there. It was a living organism, a collective body, and whoever approached understood, without anyone explaining, that they were entering a field of living memory. There, the silence weighed differently, not as a weight of pain, but as a density of meaning, as if each step were within an ancient dream that still pulses. One morning, someone came and sat for hours with a notebook on his lap. He wrote just one sentence: "Here, even the shadows are welcome." Then he left the notebook open among the rocks. It rained in the afternoon. The notebook got wet, the letters ran, but the sentence remained visible, even if crooked, and those who passed by later read it and cried, not out of sadness, but out of relief. And Amaterasu, seeing all this, understood that her story was no longer just hers. It was for everyone who had to stop one day, for everyone who will still need to. And that was beautiful because it showed that, in the end, what transforms the most is not the light itself. It is the way it touches those who were in the dark. The clearing, now expanded in memory and presence, was no longer a fixed place. It began to live inside people. There were those who carried it at a slower pace, those who expressed it in the way they served tea, those who kept it alive by listening without rushing. The clearing had become a state of mind, an internal space where pause was sacred and silence a gesture of care. The trees around were already growing differently. The branches curved inwards, as if welcoming the space that was forming between roots and memory. Birds sang there only at dawn and dusk, respecting the cadence of the day that begins and ends. And the insects, small travelers on the ground, walked around the cracked mirror as if recognizing paths that should not be touched. In a distant city, an artist began painting the cave's history in discrete murals. Hidden among alleys and back walls, he painted partial faces, pieces of mirror, closed eyes. He used soft, almost faded colors and never signed his name. Those who saw it rarely knew what it was. But I felt it. I felt there was an invitation to silence there, stopping, to recognize yourself in something that didn't need to be explained. And over time, they began to leave flowers in front of the mural, folded paper with short sentences, pocket mirrors hanging on rusty nails, even a notebook wet from the rain, where someone wrote, "The light found me when I stopped looking for it." In the sky, Amaterasu made her crossing with less haste. She stopped in unlikely places, over forgotten deserts, over nameless islands, over small balconies where someone sat alone with a hot cup. Her presence was like a light towel on the shoulders, discreet, constant, without imposition. She no longer needed to be remembered with words. She was felt, and that, for a goddess, was the purest kind of permanence. One night, she sat on the edge of a celestial lake and observed the reflection of the world, not just the water, but the reflection of what people had done with their history. She saw a child leave a mirror under his bed so he could sleep without fear. She saw a man lying on the sand staring at the sky without thinking about anything. She saw an elderly woman teach her granddaughter the importance of listening with her eyes, and in these gestures, she saw herself not as a legend, but as a reflection of what can happen when someone has the courage to disappear, and then, without rushing, return. Susanoo From afar, followed his path with lighter steps. He no longer planted trees. Now he just walked, and wherever he passed, the wind changed, the dust settled, and the feeling that something had been touched remained for hours. It was not a miracle, it was presence. And when a child asked his grandfather who was the man in the dark cloak, who passed by without saying anything, the old man answered, someone who learned not to interrupt the silence, and the child, without understanding everything, understood enough not to forget. In May Village, the central mirror was removed, not for breaking, but per cycle. May decided that the center should now be empty, a space where everyone could see what they needed. Some saw darkness, others, the face of someone loved, others still, nothing, and everything was accepted. The temple, once made of symbols, now stood in silence, and paradoxically, it was more crowded than ever, because it didn't require faith, just presence, and whoever entered felt it. Amaterasu, passing over the temple on a cold morning, let a ray of light slowly cross the entrance. It touched the ground. He touched the void, and there he stood for a moment. Then he followed, because now she knew. The clearing, the cave, the mirror, everything would continue, even without her. And that was peace. The world turned at a serene pace. The story of Amaterasu was no longer told as something distant, but as something lived, breathed, embodied in the simplest routines. There were those who invoked her when making bread, when tending to plants, when closing their eyes for 3 minutes before a difficult conversation. She had become the space between one gesture and another, the pause point where everything could change, even without anything actually changing. And this type of presence, subtle and profound, was the most powerful, because it did not depend on memory. It depended on listening, and the world now listened more. In the clearing, a new cycle was announced. The stones stopped arriving frequently. The mirrors no longer appeared as before, but it wasn't oblivion. It was maturity. It was like a field that, after many harvests, begins to rest. Now, people who arrived just came to sit down, to look, breathe. They would stay for hours without moving, and when they left no objects behind, just what they carried inside. The clearing, accustomed to the gesture, now learned to maintain silence without any news. And that was beautiful, because the maturity of silence is recognizing that it is not always necessary to add. Sometimes just keep it. In a house high on a hillside, an elderly woman spent her days weaving threads that would not become clothes. Weaving for the sake of weaving. He said that each point was a memory that needed to be crossed calmly. Beside him, a bowl of water. In front of you, a window to the sky. And one afternoon, seeing a ray of light pass through the fabric, she smiled, not because the light surprised her, but because she knew she had been seen, not as a figure, but as a part, as a continuation of what began one day with a goddess who withdrew so she could return with more truth. In May's village, the older apprentices now traveled alone. Each carried a mirror covered in dark cloth. When they stopped in a village, they did not announce themselves as masters. They simply asked, "Do you have a place to listen?" If there was, they stayed. If not, they left in silence. Little by little, they created circles. Sometimes they lasted a day, other times a month. They left no monuments, only memories. And these memories, later, sprouted in small gestures, like a child who decides to listen before speaking, or a father who holds his child's hand and simply stands there, without advice, only presence. Amaterasu, observing all this, understood that her light now had a body, and it wasn't just hers. It was a light passing between human hands, between pauses in prayer, between deep breaths in the dark. She no longer needed to hold the sky alone. Others also sustained the day. And this was no loss of power. It was sharing. And in sharing, she discovered a more lasting kind of glow. One that doesn't tire, because it comes from many, because it flows through everyone. One night, while the world slept, she returned to the cave entrance. The big stone was still there, the visible marks of time, but now there was moss covering the edges and small flowers in the crevices. He sat down in front of the rock as he had done so long ago, but now there was no pain, no doubt, just recognition. That place that was once his escape was now his foundation. She placed her palm against the stone and murmured, "Thank you." Then he closed his eyes. It stayed like that for a long time, until the sky begins to lighten. And then he slowly stood up. No rush, because now, more than ever, I knew. The day only begins when the soul is ready. The sky brightened with a tone not seen every day, a silent golden color, which did not shout its arrival. It was as if the light, when it was born, had learned to listen too. Amaterasu remained in front of the cave for a few more minutes. The sun, its own reflection, rose slowly over the horizon. Nothing rushed. Nothing was urgent. And in that moment of encounter between light, stone, memory, and breath, something was completed. Not as an end, but as maturation. The clarity that only comes after a well-lived shadow. The warmth that only welcomes you after the cold has been crossed with presence. She took a few steps back. He looked once more, and he smiled. The stone, which had previously seemed like a blockage, was now a portal, and she knew that whoever got there would not see an end. You would see an invitation. In other corners of the world, the day was also dawning. A fisherman tied his net more lightly. A child woke up without fear of the dark. A couple, separated by distance, looked at the same sky without knowing it. And in these simple gestures, the history of the cave continued to breathe. May, in her mirrorless temple, lit a candle in silence. The notebook with the words of the apprentices was now open, exposed to the weather, and the pages, although worn, seemed more alive than ever. Here, even the shadows are welcome. The calmest reflection was the one I didn't try to understand. You can stop, phrases that didn't need to be recited, just remembered, like soft echoes of a path already taken. In the clearing, the pile of stones no longer grew, but it didn't decrease either. It just kept going, like a constant breath, like a heart that beats even when no one is listening. The wildflowers had become part of the place. The foggy mirrors still reflected fragments, and the light that reached there was always gentle. Some arrived and cried, others chuckled softly, and everyone, in some way, left different, not by magic, but because they had been heard by a silence that knows pain and does not try to fix it. Just welcome. Amaterasu ascended to the heavens with slow steps. She was no longer the goddess who needed to shine brightly to prove she existed. She was the one who chose where to play, where to warm up, where to stay. His light was now medicine, no show, and those who felt it knew this light understands. That light listened. That light has already gone out, and that's why you know exactly how to get back to it. In the sky, she looked down at the world below, and for a moment, everything seemed peaceful. Not because there was no pain, but because now there was room for her. And where there is space, there is also a path. Far away, Susanoo walked through an open field. The wind was light, the sky was clear. In his hands he carried a single flower he had picked along the way. He didn't know where he would leave it. Maybe on a rock, maybe by the river, maybe nowhere. And in that aimless walk, there was a kind of forgiveness that didn't need to be said. A kind of presence that didn't need to be seen, only felt, like a warmth that remains even after the fire has gone out. Amaterasu, in her circular path, passed over him without announcing herself, but he knew. He stopped, he looked at the sky, he smiled, and continued the story of the dark cave. Then, never ended. It continues in each person who needs to stop, in each respected pause, in each small gesture that says, "Today, I choose to stay with myself." And in these silent and courageous choices, the light is renewed every morning, with each silence, with each return. Good night.